The storm had teeth. It chewed through the valley, snapping branches, driving the snow sideways in ragged sheets that made the horizon vanish. To anyone out there, the world was gone. Only white and wind and the sting of frozen air that clawed at lungs. Inside a cabin half buried in drifts, the world was no softer. A single flame burned in the iron stove, throwing shadows across rough timber walls. The man who fed it, Elias Carter, moved like someone accustomed to silence. His hands were calloused, his shoulders bowed by years of work and years of something heavier. In the next room, his daughter slept beneath quilts patched from her mother's dresses, a small hand clutching a worn stuffed bear. Elias sat in the rocker, shotgun resting across his knees, eyes drawn again and again to the rattling window panes. The storm had a way of carrying sound, twisting it, making ghosts of the night. A whistle became a cry, a groan of timber became the howl of something alive. He told himself that, as he always did, but tonight felt different. Tonight the storm was not alone. Headlights cut through the snow like lanterns from some other world. At first one beam, then another, then many. Elias straightened, breath caught in his throat. Engines. The low, guttural growl of motorcycles fighting the wind. He counted them, too many. 20, maybe more. Each machine heaving its weight against the storm until, one by one, they crawled into the clearing before his home. Leather and steel glistened with ice. Men climbed off their bikes, staggering in the snow, bandanas crusted white, eyes hollow from the cold. They looked less like travelers than survivors dragged from the grave. At their head was a giant, broad as an oak, beard frozen stiff, gaze hard as cut stone. He lifted a hand, not to knock, not to beg, just to signal. The others waited. Elias didn't move. His grip on the shotgun tightened until his knuckles turned pale. He thought of June sleeping in the next room, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear like her mother once did. He thought of the graves behind the cabin, small wooden crosses leaning beneath the snow. He thought of war, of men who came in the night with faces like this, hungry and broken. But the storm howled louder, shaking the roof, and Elias knew the truth. Without shelter, they would die. He rose slowly, the chair creaking like a warning. The door groaned open and the cold lunged inside, biting his face, his chest, his heart. The leader stepped forward, boots crunching in the snow. He didn't ask, didn't threaten, didn't explain. He just met Elias's eyes, two men measuring the weight of the moment in silence. Behind him, 20 bikers shifted, stamping their feet, waiting. Elias stepped aside. They filed in, the cabin shrinking with each body that crossed the threshold. Leather dripped onto the floor. Steam rose from gloves held to the stove. Breath fogged the air until the room was thick with it. No one spoke above a mutter. No one laughed. These were not men celebrating warmth. They were men who had forgotten it. The giant, the one they called Bear in the whispers that passed between them, remained standing by the door. He leaned his back against the wood, arms folded, a sentinel more than a guest. Elias took his place near the stove, shotgun never far, eyes never leaving the strangers who now filled his home. In the corner, June stirred. A small cough, a shift beneath the quilts. One of the men turned, hearing it, and Elias's heart hammered so loud he swore the whole room felt it. But Bear's gaze cut sharp, and the man looked away. The hours stretched thin. The storm pressed harder, walls trembling under its weight, wind screaming like it meant to tear the cabin apart. Inside, the bikers thawed slowly, faces softening into something human again, though shadows of hunger and rage clung to them. Elias fed the stove, his silence heavier than any words he might have spoken. When midnight came, Bear finally moved. He stepped close to Elias, the boards beneath him groaning, and for a long moment they stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the fire. His voice, when it came, was low, almost a growl. "Storm will bury the valley before dawn." Elias didn't answer. Bear's eyes flicked toward the closed door where June lay. His jaw tightened, then he nodded once, as if acknowledging something between them that didn't need words. He returned to his post at the door, and Elias breathed again. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, 20 bikers slept on the floorboards, their engines silenced but their presence like thunder waiting in the dark. Elias sat awake until his eyes burned, the weight of the shotgun heavy on his lap. knowing dawn would not come quietly. The storm did not end with morning. It deepened. The wind screamed against the shutters, snow pressed high against the walls, and the world outside was gone. The cabin was no longer a home but a lifeboat adrift on an endless white sea. Inside, 20 bikers stirred from the floor, stiff from sleep, their leather stiffened with frost. Their boots had left dark pools on the wood. Their breath still hung in the cold air. Elias rose before them, as he always did. He moved quietly through the small kitchen, setting a pot of snow melt over the fire, breaking the last loaf of bread into thin slices. June clung to his side, her eyes wide at the sight of so many strangers crowding their living space. She did not speak, though her gaze often drifted to the largest of them all, the one called Bear, who remained as silent as stone, always watching. The bikers ate without thanks, tearing the bread in rough hands, drinking the hot water like it was whiskey. Hunger made men savage, and Elias saw it in their eyes. They were not here by choice, not trapped in his cabin for comfort. They were on the run from something. He could feel it, smell it in the silence between them. When the food was gone, arguments sparked. Two of the men snarled over a strip of dried meat, voices rising, fists ready. Elias's hand found the shotgun, but before he could rise, Bear was there. He didn't shout, didn't strike. He simply put one hand on each man's shoulder, his grip enough to drag them apart. His eyes burned into them, and they lowered their heads like chastised dogs. The room fell silent again. The hours crept by. Elias kept to his work, chopping the last of the wood pile, patching cracks where the wind forced its way in. He worked with a quiet desperation, knowing the supplies would not last. Every board nailed, every log split was another hour bought against the storm. And every time he looked up, Bear was watching him, not with threat, but with a strange weight Elias could not yet name. At night, the wolves came. Their howls cut through the storm, wild, hungry, circling closer. The bikers stirred uneasily, some reaching for knives, others for pistols hidden in their packs. June woke crying, and Elias gathered her close, his hand pressed over her ear to block the sound. He remembered nights in the trenches when the world outside the wire sounded just like this, predators waiting for the weak to stumble. Bear moved then, stepping out into the storm without a word. The wind swallowed him whole, but through the cracks of the shutter Elias saw him, broad silhouette lit by the firelight spilling from the cabin. He stood there, face to the snow, until the wolves fell silent. When he returned, he shook the frost from his beard and sat by the door once more, as though nothing had happened. The bikers whispered after that. Names of towns left behind, debts unpaid, brothers buried. Elias caught fragments, mention of blood spilled, of men hunting them, of a reckoning that waited somewhere down the mountain. He tried not to listen, but the words sank into him all the same. These men were not just wanderers caught in the storm. They carried danger with them, and danger always found its way home. That night, after June had drifted back to sleep, Elias sat alone by the fire. The cabin smelled of leather, smoke, and wet wool. He stared at the flame, but in it he saw her, his wife, gone these many years. The sickness had taken her slow, hollowing her until nothing remained but the ghost of her voice. Keep her safe, she had whispered to him before the end, her hand trembling in his. No matter what comes. Now 20 outlaws lay stretched across his floorboards, their weapons hidden but near, their loyalties bound not to him but to one another. And outside, somewhere in the storm, engines would be coming. He could feel it in his bones, the way a soldier feels the silence before a shell lands. Bear joined him by the fire at last. He crouched low, holding his hands to the flames, though his eyes were far away. For a long while neither spoke. The crackle of wood was the only voice between them. Then Bear's gaze slid toward June's small form beneath the quilts, and something softened in his face. You hold a lot of weight, he said finally, his voice rough as gravel. Elias didn't answer. More than most men I've met. Still, Elias said nothing. But his hand, resting on the shotgun, loosened slightly. Bear nodded once, as though that was all he needed. He rose and returned to his place at the door. Elias watched him go, torn by something he couldn't quite name. Distrust and fear still ran deep, But in the quiet of that moment, when the storm pressed hardest against the walls and the wolves circled unseen, he felt the faint stirrings of something else, the knowledge that even the fiercest men carried shadows, and in shadows sometimes lived the smallest flicker of light. Toward dawn, he stepped outside for wood. The wind cut him raw, but beneath its roar he heard it low, distant, unmistakable. The rumble of engines carried on the storm. Not 20 this time. Many more.
A swarm.
He stood in the snow, breath sharp in his chest, and closed his eyes. The storm was not the only thing closing in. Death was riding toward his home. Dawn came like the drawing of a blade, slow, cold, inevitable. The storm had broken in the night, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the wind had ever been. The snow lay deep around the cabin, a white shroud that buried the fences, the path, even the graves. For a moment, the world seemed frozen in its own death. Then came the sound. Engines. Not 20 this time, but 100 more. The earth trembled beneath them, a low thunder that rolled down the valley until the walls of the cabin shook. Elias stood at the window, June clutched to his side, her small fingers gripping the fabric of his coat. Across the room, the bikers rose, one after another, pulling on gloves, tightening belts, sliding steel into holsters. No one spoke. The time for words was gone. Bear strapped his leather vest over his shoulders and looked to Elias. His face was carved from silence, but his eyes carried the truth. They had brought the storm here, and now it would break. The first bikes appeared through the mist of morning, their headlights cutting through the pale light, their engines roaring in unison. Dozens, then scores. The sound was deafening, a living tide of steel and fury rolling into the valley. They fanned out across the snow, black figures against white, circling like vultures over a kill. Elias's heart hammered. He thought of June, of her small body buried under quilts, of the promise whispered by a dying woman years ago. He could stay silent, hand these men over, let the storm of violence pass by his door. But as he looked at Bear, at the bikers standing tense and ready, he knew there was no such choice. The storm had already chosen him. The first shot cracked the silence. Glass shattered as a bullet tore through the window, embedding itself in the far wall. June screamed, and Elias pulled her down, covering her with his body. The bikers roared like animals, returning fire through the broken panes, the cabin erupting with the thunder of pistols and rifles. Smoke filled the room, the air thick with cordite and fire. The siege began. Men poured from their bikes, rushing the cabin, boots crunching on snow. Elias shoved June under the table, pressing her into the shadows, and then rose with a shotgun in his hands. His first blast dropped a man in the snow, a dark bloom spreading across the white. His second tore into the doorway, scattering those who dared press closer. The bikers fought like men with nothing left to lose. Steel flashed in the smoke, bullets cracked through the walls, the wooden beams groaned under the assault. Bear was everywhere, his massive frame a wall of defiance, his fists and gunfire striking with brutal precision. He dragged one of his brothers back from the door, blood running from his side, then turned to cover Elias, with a barked command Elias didn't need to understand. The hours of war came back to him then, the taste of smoke, the heat of fear, the clarity that comes when death presses, so close you can feel its breath. He fought with everything left in him, every pull of the trigger a promise to his daughter, every shot a shield against the darkness. But the storm outside was endless. The rival gangs surged forward in waves, their engines still growling, their shouts cutting through the smoke. The cabin shook with the weight of it, the door splintering under the assault, the shutters hanging loose. Elias knew they could not hold. Then it happened. One of the men broke through, a knife flashing in the dim light, lunging for the table where June cowered. Elias turned, too far, too slow, and Bear was there. He moved like a beast unleashed, slamming the man back against the wall, the knife sinking into his own flesh as he drove his attacker down. The gunshot that followed echoed like thunder, and the man went still. Bear staggered, blood spreading across his chest, and for the first time, Elias saw something break in his face. He fell to one knee, his hand finding June's small shoulder. He looked at her the way a man looks at something holy, something beyond redemption, and in that silence, he gave everything he had left. Then he pushed her toward Elias, blood trailing down his arm. "Keep her safe," he rasped. The words were almost lost in the roar, but Elias heard them as clearly as if they had been carved into his skin. Bear rose once more, charging into the doorframe, dragging 2 more men down with him in a storm of fists and steel. The gunfire swallowed him whole, but his roar carried through it, a final echo that shook the cabin to its bones. When the smoke cleared, the rival gang was breaking. Their numbers thinned, their resolve shattered by the fury of men who refused to die quietly. Engines roared as they fled into the valley, their retreat as thunderous as their arrival. The silence that followed was raw, jagged, terrible. The cabin stood broken. Walls torn, windows shattered, the floor soaked with blood. The bikers that remained stood in weary silence, weapons hanging loose, their eyes on the snow outside. Bear lay still at the threshold, his massive body finally at rest, the storm he carried gone at last. Elias knelt beside him, June pressed against his side, her small hand clinging to his sleeve. He closed Bear's eyes with trembling fingers, a weight pressing heavy in his chest. This man, who had carried violence like a crown, had given his last breath for something pure. When the survivors mounted their bikes again, the valley shook with the sound. One by one, they rode off into the horizon, engines echoing like a hymn, leaving behind only silence and smoke. Elias stood in the doorway, June at his side, watching until the last of them vanished into the white. The storm had passed, but nothing would ever be the same. He looked down at his daughter, her face streaked with tears, her eyes still wide with fear. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "We're not alone anymore," he whispered, though his voice cracked as he said it. Snow drifted from the roof, the world settling back into silence. And in that silence, Elias felt the weight of the storm, of loss, of sacrifice. But he also felt something else, something fragile but alive. Hope, carried on the thunder that had shaken his home and left behind a promise.